Around 9,500 years ago, on the island of Cyprus, someone dug a small grave and laid a cat inside it. Not a wild cat killed for its fur, not a carcass tossed aside. A cat placed deliberately in the earth, less than half a meter from the body of a human being, buried at the same moment. The two graves sat parallel, aligned, sealed together under the Mediterranean soil. Whoever did this carried the animal there on purpose. They arranged it with care. And then the island closed over both of them and held them in silence for 9,500 years. Nobody knows the cat's name, if it had one. Nobody knows whether it slept by a fire, whether it was fed by hand, whether the person beside it wept when it died. We know only that someone on a small island in the eastern Mediterranean thought a cat was worth burying like a person. For a long time, we believed that grave told us where the story started. We believe the cat at your feet right now was the descendant of animals like that one, tamed in the Fertile Crescent at the dawn of farming, carried west into Europe, settled into our homes thousands of years before Rome. We were wrong about almost all of it. The cat in that Cyprus grave left no descendants in your living room. The animal curled on your windowsill is far younger than we thought, came from somewhere we did not expect, and arrived in Europe so recently that the timeline in the textbooks is off by thousands of years. The genetics have spent the last decade quietly dismantling the story of the cat, and what is emerging is stranger than the myth it replaced. This is what the DNA actually shows. Let's begin. For most of the last century, the origin of the domestic cat seemed like one of the easier domestication stories to tell. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward the ancient Near East and toward Egypt, and the case was genuinely strong. Egypt gave us cats everywhere we looked. Cats painted on tomb walls, seated beneath the chairs of noble women, collars around their necks, gnawing fish bones under the dinner table. Cats mummified by the hundreds of thousands and buried in vast cemeteries. At a single site, Beni Hassan, 19th century excavators reportedly uncovered cat mummies in such quantity that tons of them were shipped to England and ground into agricultural fertilizer. An entire sacred necropolis scattered across English fields as fortune for turnips. The goddess Bastet, with her feline head, worshipped in temples where cats were bred, sacrificed, and interred as sacred offerings. No civilization in history left a richer record of its relationship with the cat. If you wanted a birthplace for the house cat, Egypt looked unanswerable, and the biology agreed. Genetic analysis showed clearly that every domestic cat alive today descends from a single wild species, Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, a slim, long-legged, large-eared animal that still lives across North Africa and the Near East today. Stand one beside a tabby and you can barely tell them apart. The same mackerel stripes, the same banded tail, the same yellow-green stare. Not the European wildcat, which forms its own distinct and unrelated genetic cluster, a thicker, blunter, more truculent animal. Not the Central Asian or Southern African wildcats. One specific lineage of one specific wildcat, native to exactly the region where farming began. The pieces fit. The wildcat lived where the first grain was stored, and stored grain meant mice, and mice meant a wild predator with a reason to come close. Cats domesticated themselves in the Fertile Crescent around the dawn of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago. Lured in by the rodents infesting the first granaries. From there, they spread outward with farmers and traders, reaching Europe thousands of years before the Roman period, becoming the familiar household animal by deep antiquity. The Cyprus grave seemed to confirm the early date. Mitochondrial DNA, the small loop of genetic material passed down only through the mother, appeared to support a migration of cats out of the Near East around 6,500 years ago. There was a flaw buried in this picture, and it sat in that last piece of evidence. Mitochondrial DNA is easy to recover from ancient bones. because each cell carries hundreds or thousands of copies of it, while holding just 2 copies of the nuclear genome, which is why researchers leaned on it for decades. It survives in fragments and degraded samples, where the rest of the genome has rotted into noise. But it tells you only about the maternal line, a single thread out of an entire genome, inherited intact from mother to kitten, with no contribution from any father in the chain. It can suggest relationships that the rest of the DNA flatly contradicts. Reading cat history from mitochondrial DNA alone was like trying to reconstruct a family from a single surname. And almost no one had done the harder thing, sequencing whole genomes from large numbers of directly dated ancient cats, until very recently. The bones were scattered across museum drawers and excavation reports, often misidentified, rarely dated directly. And the technology to wring a full genome from a brittle, 1,000-year-old jawbone simply did not exist for most of the time the question was being asked. In 2025, that finally changed. A team of researchers published work, funded in part by the National Geographic Society, that did for cats what the great ancient DNA studies had already done for dogs and horses. Rather than relying on the maternal thread alone, they assembled and analyzed whole genomes from a sprawling set of ancient feline remains, spanning thousands of years and stretching across the Near East, North Africa, and Europe. They cross-referenced those ancient genomes against modern domestic cats and against the wild felis species. It was among the most comprehensive genetic looks at the cat's past ever attempted, and the result detonated the timeline that everyone had accepted. The headline finding was simple and brutal. The precursors of the modern housecat originated in North Africa, and they did not reach Europe until around 2,000 years ago. Not 6,500 years ago. Not in the deep Neolithic. Around the time of the early Roman Empire. The oldest remains of a genuinely ancestral domestic cat found on mainland Europe date to roughly the 1st century of the Common Era. The cat, it turned out, is a far more recent arrival in the Western world than the dog, the horse, or the cow, or the sheep, arriving in Europe thousands of years after all of them. The dog had been at the human hearth for more than 10,000 years before the first true house cat ever stepped off a boat into a European port. But here is where the story becomes strange, because the new genomes did something more disturbing than move a date. They severed a lineage. When the team examined ancient cats that had lived in Europe around 200 years before the Common Era, they found that those cats were not the ancestors of modern house cats at all. Genetically, the felines living around early European communities were not early domestic cats creeping westward from the Fertile Crescent. They were European wildcats, Felis sylvestris, a separate and unrelated species. The animals whose bones turn up at Stone Age European sites, the cats people had quietly assumed were the first pets, were something else entirely. Read that again. The cats that lived alongside Europe's earliest farming communities for thousands of years were not the ancestors of your cat. They were wild animals that happened to live nearby. They likely lurked at the edges of Neolithic settlements, drawn by the same rodents that the later domestic cat would exploit. Or they were hunted for their fur and their meat, which is precisely why their remains accumulate at human sites in the first place. A wildcat trapped for its pelt ends up discarded in the same midden as the kitchen scraps, and 2,000 years later, an archaeologist lifts the bones from the soil and reads companionship into what was, in life, predation in both directions. Their presence in the archaeological record had been read for generations as the opening chapter of domestication. It was nothing of the kind. It was a case of mistaken identity written into the textbooks. A wild animal cast as a pet because it happened to die near people. And this reaches back to that grave on Cyprus, the one that seemed to anchor the whole early domestication story. A cat buried beside a human 9,500 years ago is real, and it is extraordinary evidence that people on that island had some kind of relationship with cats astonishingly early. It is worth remembering that Cyprus has no native wildcats at all. Whatever cat lies in that grave did not wander there on its own four legs. Someone put it in a boat, alive, and carried it across open sea to an island where its kind had never lived, which tells you the relationship was already deliberate, already deep enough to be worth the trouble of transport. And yet the new genomic work shows that this relationship, whatever it was a dead end with respect to the cat in your home. The Cyprus burial was not the beginning of an unbroken line stretching to your sofa. It was an early, isolated chapter of human-feline contact that left no genetic mark on the modern domestic cat. The evolutionary biologist Jonathan Losos, reflecting on the new work, put it plainly: the old theory that cats dispersed across the world around 6,500 years ago was inaccurate, and the whole genome analysis shows no such migration occurred. The mitochondrial DNA, that single misleading thread, had pointed everyone in the wrong direction for years. So if the European cats were wild imposters, and the Cyprus cat was a lineage that vanished, where did your cat actually come from? The genomes converge on North Africa and on a window of time far narrower and far later than anyone had drawn. The closer genetic connection appears only between modern housecats and felines that lived within the last 2,000 years. Somewhere in North Africa, the African wildcat lineage that would become the domestic cat consolidated and then spread, carried outward not by Neolithic farmers, but by the dense, connected, trade-soaked world of classical antiquity. The cat rode into Europe on the back of empire, along Roman roads and Roman shipping lanes, into Roman cities full of grain and rats. Grain ships out of North Africa were the breadbasket of Rome, and a hold full of wheat is a hold full of mice, and a hold full of mice is the perfect berth for a small predator that has learned not to fear the gangplank. The animal we treat as ancient is, in the places most of us live, an animal of the historical era, contemporary with concrete, with aqueducts, with written law. The DNA cannot tell us the exact moment a wild African cat became a tame one. It cannot tell us the first hand that fed one, or the first ship that carried one across the Mediterranean. It can only tell us that the transformation happened later and further south than the Egyptian temples and the Cyprus grave had led us to believe, and that the cats people had been pointing to for a century as the first pets were the wrong cats. The mystery of why this particular wildcat, of all the small cats on Earth, was the one that crossed into our homes remains genuinely open. Dozens of small wild felines share the planet with us. The sand cat, the jungle cat, the black-footed cat, many of them living in close proximity to people for just as long, and not one of them ever made the crossing into the human household. As one feline geneticist put it, cats are still mysterious, and they are giving up their secrets one whisker at a time. What kind of animal was being pulled into human society in the process? Not a tamed predator in the way a dog is a tamed wolf. The cat domesticated itself in the loosest possible sense. The African wildcat that drifted toward human settlements was lured, like the chicken to the rice field, by an environment we had accidentally built for it. Grain stores bred rodents, and rodents drew the cat. The boldest, least fearful wildcats gained the richest hunting grounds at the edge of human life, and over generations, a population emerged that tolerated people without fleeing. Crucially, the cat was never reshaped for work the way other domesticates were. We bred dogs to herd and guard and haul, cattle for milk and muscle, horses for a back that could carry us. The cat we changed almost not at all. It did the one job it already did in the wild, killing the small things that ate our food and asked for no instruction in how to do it. Genetically and anatomically, the housecat remains startlingly close to its wild ancestor. So close that domestic cats and African wildcats still interbreed freely wherever their ranges overlap, a fact that has begun to threaten the genetic purity of wild populations in places like Scotland, where the native wildcat has been hybridized nearly out of existence by the housecats living alongside it. Your cat is, in the most literal sense, a wild animal that has agreed to live indoors. This is also why the cat's interior architecture is so deeply, ancestrally feline. The domestic cat carries a chromosomal structure that is highly representative of all cats and ancestral for most carnivores, 18 autosomal pairs, and the XY sex pair, 38 in all. A genomic blueprint so conserved that researchers use the cat as a stand-in for the entire order of carnivores. When the National Institutes of Health first chose to sequence the cat genome, the work drew on DNA from a single, highly inbred Abyssinian named Cinnamon, whose pedigree was known back through generations, making her variations easy to track. Even that early effort revealed hundreds of thousands of variant sites scattered across a genome that, researchers later found, has long stretches arranged in an order strikingly similar to the human genome, with fewer of the shuffling rearrangements that scramble the chromosomes of mice and many other mammals. The Animal Asleep on Your Bed is a living reference library for the deep history of predatory mammals. Its chromosomes a nearly untouched record of what a carnivore was supposed to look like. And here, the story becomes darker, because while the deep cat is ancient and barely altered, a thin and very recent layer has been painted over the top of it, and that layer is almost entirely a human invention of the last century and a half. For nearly all of its history with us, the cat had no breeds. There were regional types, shaped by climate and chance, the dense coat of a northern cat, the lean frame of a desert one, but nothing like the closed, codified, pedigreed categories we know now. That apparatus is astonishingly young. The first major cat show was staged at the Crystal Palace in London in 1871, organized by the artist and writer Harrison Weir, an event explicitly designed to define and display the cat as a fancy object rather than a working mouser, complete with written standards and ribbons for the finest specimens. The breed concept, the standards, the registries, the idea that a cat belonged to a named and bounded type, all of it crystallized in the Victorian era. Within the last 150 years, the same decades that manufactured the modern dog breed out of older working types. The genetic consequences echo what happened to dogs on a smaller scale. The DNA markers that geneticists use to study cats split neatly into two registers. Single nucleotide polymorphisms, single letter changes scattered through the genome, carry the deep signal, the thousands of years old story of the African wildcat and its journey. But microsatellites, short stretches of repeated DNA that mutate quickly, carry a different and much shallower signal, one that tracks the breed populations and developments of only the past few hundred years. Read together, they show a cat that is ancient in its foundation and brand new at its surface. The Siamese, the Persian, the Siberian, the breeds we treat as old and distinct, are recent constructions built on tiny founder populations and maintained through intense inbreeding, and they carry the predictable burden of that history. Whole genome work on individual cats has already pinned specific inherited diseases to single mutations passed down through narrow breed lines, like the frameshift mutation in the polycystin gene that produces polycystic kidney disease, traced through the pedigree of an affected Siberian cat. The kidneys slowly crowded with fluid-filled cysts because of a single deleted run of letters carried down a closed bloodline. The flat face of the Persian, prized in the show ring, is the same kind of engineering that gives the breed its chronic tearing ace and breathing trouble. The pedigreed cat, like the pug and the bulldog, is a Victorian idea wearing an ancient animal's body. What does this mean for the cat sitting on the windowsill right now, watching the street with the flat indifference of something that does not need you? It means the animal beside you is far stranger than the myth that surrounded it. It is not an Egyptian relic. It is not the descendant of the cat buried on Cyprus, nor of the wild felines that haunted Neolithic Europe. Those lineages led nowhere. Your cat descends from a North African wildcat that consolidated into the domestic form thousands of years more recently than anyone believed, and that reached most of the Western world only about 2,000 years ago, riding the roads and ships of the Roman world into the rat-rich cities of antiquity. It is a recent arrival wearing the costume of something primordial, and it means your cat is barely domesticated at all. We did not rebuild it the way we rebuilt the horse or the dog. We let it in, fed it, and changed almost nothing of substance. Beneath the thin Victorian veneer of breeds and shows, the genome is that of a wild predator, conserved across millions of years, still close enough to its wild cousins to breed with them in an alley. This is why a housecat dropped into the countryside reverts to a fully functional hunter within a single generation. No retraining required, the wild software intact beneath the domestic skin. The cat at your feet is not a tame thing that became wild-looking. It is a wild thing that learned to tolerate us and never fully surrendered. Around 9,500 years ago, on the island of Cyprus, someone laid a cat in a grave beside a human being and covered them both with earth. We do not know that person's name. We do not know what the cat was to them, or whether the animal had ever truly belonged to anyone. And we now know that whatever bond they shared, it left no trace in the cat watching you from across the room tonight. That cat came later from somewhere else, by a route no one had guessed. The grave on Cyprus was not the beginning of your cat's story. It was a different story entirely, one that ended in the ground and was never spoken again. What the DNA finally revealed is not just where the cat came from, but how recently it arrived, how little we changed it, and how much of the wild it still carries, asleep and indifferent in your home. If you found this story remarkable, consider subscribing. There are more origins to uncover, and the DNA is only beginning to tell us what it knows.